Thank you for joining us today on Connect and Collaborate Radio. My name is Jon Ekstrom. I am your on-air producer, and this is a production of Vital for Colorado. And joining me today is our CEO and Chairman, Peter Moore. Peter, it's a pleasure to have you as always.
Well, thanks a lot, John. I really enjoy the opportunity to meet all these interesting people. We've been doing this now for over 55 hours of radio, and it's been a real pleasure for me.
It's always great when we get to connect with people sort of outside of our sphere in Colorado. They have interest in Colorado, but maybe aren't here locally, and that's the case with our guest today. Today we have Lindsey Torre, and she is with the Manufacturers Accountability Project. Lindsey, thank you for joining us today via phone.
Yes, thanks, John. Thanks so much for having me on to talk about this important issue, and Peter, great to be with you as well.
Well, before we talk about your primary project right now, which is the Manufacturers Accountability Project, you've had a strong career in the government as a lawyer. Could you tell us a bit about your background over the last 12, 14 years?
Sure, yeah. You know, public service has been a big part of my career. And sort of probably the most meaningful part of my career. I worked in the White House and in the Department of Justice. It was an honor to work for President Bush and get to witness his commitment to public service firsthand. And I worked in multiple roles, both at the White House and at the Department of Justice, including the Office of Intergovernmental Affairs and the Office of the Associate Attorney General, as well as the Office of Presidential Personnel at the White House. And in that role, I had the opportunity to brief the President on Senate-confirmed appointees to serve within his administration. And he tasked us with finding folks that were interested in serving something bigger than themselves and representing the best and the brightest of Americans throughout the country. So it was a great honor.
Wow, that's fantastic. And certainly unique in terms of, you're certainly not alone in that, but in terms of the scope of this show, I don't know that we've had someone of that stature.
Don't think so, but I think you've also taken your commitment to public service over to other very important issues, and now you're at the National Association of Manufacturers. Why don't you tell us about the state of manufacturing across America and what brought you to this trade association?
Absolutely. Manufacturers are the lifeblood of the economy, and they contribute $2.2 trillion to the American economy every year. And so, in particular, the National Association of Manufacturers launched the Manufacturers Accountability Project last year. In response to a trend that we're seeing across the country of plaintiffs' attorneys and politicians bringing baseless suits against manufacturers. And I know you've seen that here recently in Colorado. And really, at the end of the day, these lawsuits stand to enrich trial attorneys at the expense of America's manufacturers. And so this is an important issue, and I've enjoyed working on it. And essentially these lawsuits are blaming manufacturers for damages related to the global challenge of climate change. And from a manufacturer standpoint, we're concerned that if this trend continues, it could harm manufacturers of all sectors and sizes. So right now, the target is energy manufacturers, but these lawsuits put all American industries on notice that they could find themselves financially responsible for a global issue that's beyond their control. And so that's why the National Association of Manufacturers has launched this project, really to stand up for America's manufacturers.
That's a connection I didn't intuitively make. When I think of manufacturers, I think of equipment manufacturers. I think of sort of a sister organization to yours, the Association of Equipment Distributors. But you're really thinking of manufacturers in terms of E&P companies and exploration and production companies. Those are manufacturing energy for this country.
Yes, we represent a broad range of manufacturers, manufacturers of all sectors and sizes.
Yeah, it's remarkable, and one of the things, Peter, that we've talked about on this show extensively, without stating explicitly, is once you get into oil and gas, and you talk about building a wellbore, and that's sort of the nomenclature that's used in the oil and gas industry is it's basically a construction project. It's a manufacturing project that goes underground,
Right.
with all of the cement and steel that goes into wellbore casings, and that all needs to come from somewhere. So. What you're talking about, Lindsey, is almost the beginning of the process in terms of, how do you stop development at the wellhead? And Vital for Colorado is an organization and a coalition of more than 85,000 people, all designed to support energy development. So when you're talking about an attack on manufacturers, by extension, that tends to roll downhill in ways that I think a lot of people don't appreciate.
Just
Yes,
for
and,
some stats in Colorado, if you think of primary and secondary employment in Colorado for the oil and gas industry itself, we're talking about over 230,000 people and over $31 billion of GDP for a state like Colorado. So it's very, very significant in terms of our vertical, and it's also very significant nationwide. People say
Yeah.
you can't blame the weather, but people are blaming the weather, aren't they? What is the genesis, very, very broad strokes, of the climate change lawsuits? What are they all about?
Yeah, and to your point, I guess, in talking about manufacturers, we represent 14,000 manufacturers, manufacturers of all sectors and sizes. And so, from our standpoint, we pinpoint trends that we're seeing that affect our members broadly. And this is an issue that's come about. To date, 10 lawsuits have been filed that are similar to the one that was recently filed in Colorado, in the city of Boulder, Boulder County, and San Miguel. California has brought 9 of these suits in municipalities and cities in Oakland, San Francisco, San Mateo, Imperial Beach. The list goes on, and New York City has also brought these types of cases. And, most recently, Colorado is another example of trial attorneys attempting to enrich themselves at the expense of manufacturers and manufacturing workers. And, the truth is that these lawsuits do nothing to improve the environment and really are just a waste of taxpayer resources. As you know well, manufacturers are working towards meaningful solutions. They're reducing emissions, and meanwhile, the cities are wasting time suing them for products that Americans rely on for their everyday lives. And so, again, this is a trend that we're seeing that's alarming to us. This approach has failed in court. Repeatedly, courts have found that the executive and legislative branches, not the courts, are the proper channels to address this issue, including a Supreme Court decision in 2011. It was called AEP versus Connecticut. And the decision written by Ruth Bader Ginsburg determined that the Clean Air Act preempts these claims. So we know it's a non-starter in the courts, but we're continuing to see these cases brought, and we'll continue to push back against them. This is an issue for the executive and the legislative branches, not the courts.
And in my past, I've been a trial attorney, and before you can make a motion to dismiss on the basis of state or federal preemption, you get pretty far along in the lawsuit. And I suppose that the point of filing the lawsuit is to have great publicity and to make political hay as best you can to support your political efforts with no real expectation that you'll have a result that will benefit the taxpayers.
And I think that's what we've seen in these municipalities. Politicians that are looking to elevate their public profile at the expense of manufacturers.
In most lawsuits, there needs to be, at least in the complaint, some linkage, some proof of causation between liability and damages. And so the Boulder lawsuit, just looking here, it looks like the target defendants are ExxonMobil, Chevron, ConocoPhillips, BP, and Shell. Are you aware of any allegations of direct causation of any of these companies causing any harm to the environment? And that's meant to be a leading question. And then the converse would be, is that how do are you aware of any efforts by the courts to dismiss these lawsuits as being frivolous or groundless?
Well, and Peter, before we go any further, the suit that you were talking about with Exxon, Chevron, ConocoPhillips, BP, and Shell is, I believe, the Alameda County.
Oh, that's right. That's right. Those are the Bay Area parties.
The Boulder City and County and San Miguel, they're targeting ExxonMobil and Suncor Energy.
Right, you are. But I just, I've not studied these lawsuits, and I just think about issues of whether they're frivolous, whether they can be found to be frivolous, and what the causation claim is. I guess that's what I'm trying to ask you, Lindsey.
Well, I think, these lawsuits seek to place blame on a small group of folks for a global challenge. And Americans rely on these products for their everyday lives, and seeking to blame one sector for the global challenge of climate change, just doesn't make sense. And so, we see, that this campaign targets manufacturers and attempts to set up a false choice between manufacturing and environmental stewardship. And we strongly disagree with that. As exemplified by, manufacturers have worked hard to reduce their environmental footprint, including reducing emissions by 10% over the past 10 years, while increasing their value to the economy by 19%. So, I think this is a global issue. It's a shared challenge that cannot be pinpointed on one group, as these lawsuits have tried to do.
Well, and Peter, to that point, I think one of the things that we highlight a lot in Vital is that with increased use of natural gas, that we've seen, carbon emissions have actually declined in the United States, especially relative to other nations. We had a show recently with Chris Wright from Liberty Oilfield Services, where we discussed how on a pure carbon basis, we are at 1992 levels, yet on a per capita basis, we're at levels not seen since the 1950s. So we are producing more and more with less carbon emissions, environmental footprint. And Lindsey, I think that's exactly what you're describing, which makes these lawsuits all the more ludicrous. So, moving along, in terms of the Boulder climate change lawsuit, these are billed as public nuisance lawsuits. But before we get to that, Lindsey, something that we had talked about before we got on the air was, you mentioned something about transparency. Could you build upon that a little bit more?
Sure. One of our focuses has been to bring transparency to these cases. And to that end, we've sent FOIA letters to 9 of the municipalities. And in doing so, we found that attorneys stand to take home more than 23% of any award. And the damages they're looking for are, in the billions of dollars. So, it's easy to see why these attorneys are encouraging cities and counties to take up these cases. And we're seeing sort of the same groups of attorneys filing these cases in these municipalities. So, it's an alarming trend, and there's, the trial attorneys do stand to gain a lot of money, and so we're going to continue to call for transparency and push these cities on with the FOIA requests.
Well, one person's transparency might be another person's spotlight. That's a good thing to highlight. Have there been any settlements so far? Have any payments actually been made by any of the target defendants to any of the cities?
No, it's ongoing litigation, so there haven't been any at this point.
Yeah, but sure a great prospect for, I suppose the cigarette litigation of 20 years ago might have inspired some of this stuff.
Yeah, and we've also, interesting in sort of on the transparency front and sort of looking into to find out additional information about why these cases have been brought and the claims that have been made. We know that in these lawsuits, these cities are making very certain claims about the damages related to climate change in their lawsuits, but in their bond offerings to investors, they claim that they can't predict the damages with any certainty. So in March, the Manufacturers Accountability Project called on the SEC to investigate potential wrongdoing committed by California and New York in their bond offerings. Again, these lawsuits are saying, there are damages and that they're able to, talk about the damages for climate change, but they run contrary to the assessments in their bond offerings. So, it raises questions whether the bondholders or the courts have been misled. And again, we're looking into all aspects of these lawsuits.
That's a very good angle. As I imagine, for publicity purposes and gaining votes, you'd love to be able to pin the tail on the oil and gas companies, but when you're selling securities and selling bonds, and you need to be very, very circumspect in terms of what you say, you have to say something totally different than what the public image would be. So that's a great angle that actually makes a lot of sense to me. And the angle that you first mentioned to me of this 2011 U.S. Supreme Court case of federal preemption, it would seem to me that all these nuisance lawsuits in some form or fashion are in fact regulated or could be regulated by federal law, the Clean Air Act, and therefore should be preempted. So is there a clear pathway to dismiss lawsuits, or does it not work that well in real life?
Well, the AGs, state AGs have weighed in on this issue, and last week, 15 state AGs filed an amicus in support of manufacturers before a couple of the cases in the U.S. District for the Northern District of California in support of manufacturers of dismissal of these cases. And as you guys may know, Attorney General Kaufman signed on to that brief as well. And one of the arguments that they're making is that the courts have already repeatedly held that climate regulation is in the purview of the EPA and the political branches, not the court. State AGs also obviously care about states' rights, and so they also argue that Californians impinging on their rights as well. So having the AGs weigh in on the behalf of manufacturers it really is a significant step in defending America's manufacturers against these cases and discouraging further litigation.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting, Lindsey, because this is new to Colorado. Obviously, this lawsuit was now announced a couple of weeks ago. Where do the other ones stand, and how long does this process drag out? For anyone listening who goes, man, I've heard about this from City of Boulder, County of Boulder, San Miguel County. How long can we expect this to last before it reaches some sort of resolution?
I think it's anyone's guess. I think that they could last a long time. A hearing will take place in a few of the California cases on May 24th for dismissal. So we're anxious for that. In a different set of cases filed in California, we're waiting on the Ninth Circuit to decide whether they belong in state or federal court. And that hearing is in July. So, these cases, again, are a waste of resources. They can drag on for who knows how long, and they do nothing to improve the environment. We've called for these cases to be dismissed, and we're happy that state AGs are standing up with us.
To the principles of Vital for Colorado, we try to focus people's attention on facts and not hyperbole. and we also try to avoid the we versus they dichotomy. It seems to me in a certain sense that the purpose of the counties and the cities are to create a bogeyman. It's just that it's us against industry for the purposes of trying to build up the political constituency. But the danger is that it could have a negative effect on industry of trying to work with government, trying to work with the other stakeholders, trying to focus on reasonable regulations, because everybody seems to be wanting to just create a fight, just file a lawsuit.
Yeah, and I think you raise a good point. And I think at the National Association of Manufacturers and through this project, we want to be part of the solution, both in ending this troubling trend that we're seeing and in addressing the concerns. And these lawsuits do neither. They hurt our legal system, and they do nothing for American workers and families or the environment. So.
Well, it's interesting. You're fighting this at the legal level, but on some level, this is also a fight in the court of public opinion, where in terms of companies, and Peter, we've talked about this at length, but oil and gas companies in particular have done a historically bad job of conveying what they do, how they do it, and their stewardship to the public, which is frustrating, and they pay the price for it now. And it manifests in things like this. And, we've talked about this at length and how these lawsuits are baseless. You use the word frivolous. I think I threw out the word ludicrous. But in terms of your role in this, Lindsey, since you are representative of, National Association of Manufacturers through this Manufacturers Accountability Project, how much of what you do is based in sort of working in the court of public opinion versus in the courts proper? And we've got about 2 minutes to go.
Sure. I think, we're going to keep doing our part to provide transparency and accountability so that manufacturers and the 12.5 million jobs they provide for hardworking Americans can focus on innovative solutions, not fighting lawsuits. And so, we're not involved in the courts in the legal battle. We feel like this issue doesn't belong in the courts in the first place. So, we're going to, like I said, we're going to do our part to provide transparency and accountability so that manufacturers can spend their time working on innovative solutions and providing jobs for Americans.
Well, for many, many reasons, I optimistically can see that these lawsuits will be ultimately dismissed because they seem to be preempted. They seem to be filed in the wrong place. There does not appear to be any real proof of causation between any particular worldwide action and the actions of a particular company. And it might take years. But in thinking about accountability, I think just pure dismissal doesn't really hold the public officials that started this train sufficiently accountable. But on the other hand, you want to encourage the public officials to work with the system. So that's a interesting concept of how do you hold public officials accountable, and to what level of accountability, and how hard do you push, and what do you do after you win?
Exactly. Well, Lindsey, I'll tell you what, this was an enormous pleasure getting to chat with you. We've got about 30 seconds left. Where can people find out more about the Manufacturers Accountability Project and learn more about these lawsuits? We'd love for you to give us a plug.
Sure. Well, I really appreciate you both taking the time to talk about this important issue. For folks that are interested in learning more, they can go to our website, which is msgaccountabilityproject.org.
Terrific. Lindsey de la Torre, the Executive Director of the Manufacturers Accountability Project. It was a pleasure having you on our show, and we look forward to seeing the work that you do in the future.
Thank you very much, Lindsey.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for staying with us here on Connect and Collaborate. This is Vital for Colorado Radio. I am your on-air producer, Jon Ekstrom, joined again by Peter Moore. Peter, that was a terrific last segment talking about the Boulder climate change lawsuit, and a lot of interesting things going on there. Be interested to pivot into our next segment.
Well, there are some other, related things going on at the same time, and people are writing studies that appear to be directly contrary to information published by the Colorado Department of Health and by the state of Colorado, and from my point of view, these studies are intended just to rile people up with no really good basis in fact. But that's my suspicion, but I think our guest may know that, may have more specific information. Very happy to have Rebecca Simons, who's the field director for Energy in Depth for the Mountain States. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Yeah.
Before we talk about the Lisa McKenzie study, which is the study I was referencing, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and tell us what Energy in Depth is?
Sure. Yeah, so I spent some time in Washington, D.C. on Capitol Hill, worked on various issues. I've been in Colorado for 4 years now. I was with Colorado Farm Bureau, so I worked on some ag policy issues. And I've been with Energy in Depth now for a year. Essentially what Energy in Depth is we are a research, public outreach, and rapid response platform. What our main mission is to basically get out the proper information when a lot of times misinformation is circulated by the media. We've got field directors in all the major basins, and our job is to put the facts in front of the public.
Rapid response team, that sounds pretty ominous. I like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny, I've had a lot of experience with Energy in Depth, and the name is apropos because the level of depth that you all go into in terms of getting to the root of what activists will claim are ill effects of oil and gas or misperceptions. You all get in there with a lot of backed data in terms of both government and universities and nonpartisan studies. You back it up with a ton of data.
Yeah, definitely. And here in Colorado, obviously, Lisa McKenzie, she is a researcher out of Colorado School of Public Health. And since 2012, she's been shooting out series of anti-oil and gas studies. And what we've done as a team is we've gone through, read through these studies. Not only have we debunked, but a lot of the state's top health regulators have come out and said, this is like a scary headline that it's generating. However, here's the facts. So.
Well, part of the mission of Vital for Colorado, we're a coalition of, I guess, 86,000 Colorado citizens, over 1,000 businesses. The Colorado Farm Bureau, your former employer, is on our board of directors, as are several of the major chambers of commerce and Colorado Concern, and also a good number of just very concerned businesses. But I think the purpose of this segment is to contrast the methodology and the way that you're trying to bring information forth. And you specifically were trying to debunk these studies by a professor from the Colorado Department of Public Health, is it?
The Colorado School of Public Health.
Colorado School of Public Health. So without getting into the personalities too much, I'd like to focus on the information and the data between the two, because that really is the story, and I think that's part of the mission of Vital for Colorado, is to bring forth that story.
Yeah, definitely. Most recently, Lisa McKenzie published a study, and she used a few different things that were a little bit questionable, California state standards, to look at different things in her study. The problem with that is that in California, the standards are so stringent that even a cup of coffee now could have a cancer warning on it. So that kind of shows you the contrast between EPA standards, Colorado standards, and California.
Well, and before we get into that, I think we're burying the lead a little bit here,
Okay.
which is to say, what did the study claim? So the study that Lisa McKenzie released through the Colorado School of Public Health, what was the top line headline? What was the thing that everyone said this study purported to claim?
Living near oil and gas wells could potentially increase your risk for cancer.
Right. So, I mean, that's a very attention-grabbing headline. You're going to get people's attention when you say that, hey, if you live close to an oil and gas well, your risk for cancer goes up. And in her parlance, she said it goes up fairly significantly.
Right, using the California standards.
Exactly. So, in terms of knowing that that's the headline, what does the data actually say?
Yeah, so basically, she used a very small segment to do this data, so it was like cherry picking the study. And actually, Dr. Larry Walk, who is the Chief Medical Officer and Executive Director of CDPHE, Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, he weighed in after the study was released and some of these headlines were generating, and basically said that, what this study concludes is that more studies need to be done. So,
So essentially, you've done a study here, and I think she says that even in her study, but that's not the most public-facing part of it, where she says, this study indicates that we should really be doing more studies. But that's not the headline that she was really pushing out.
Right, and that plays into the larger playbook here, is that, what we've seen is, she puts out a study, puts out a press release, it gets picked up in the media, generates headlines, and activists begin to spread it on social media. Once those headlines are out there, these state's top health regulators come back and say, okay, this is what you need to know about this study. And so, it just creates this vicious cycle that we've seen over and over since 2012.
And put it more direct, that this study requires more studies. A blunter way to say that is that the data does not support the conclusions in this study.
Yeah.
And if you want to have conclusions like this, you need to have different data, which has not yet been obtained.
Right, and another important thing to keep in mind is, so recently, Energy in Depth, we released a health report, and we looked at all the different findings from CDPHE, publicly available data, and so CDPHE, they're well aware of the concerns of citizens, and so they've researched this. They've actually looked at 12 different studies and 27 health concerns within those studies, and one of the studies is actually Lisa McKinsey's. She had a study out last year linking childhood leukemia to oil and gas development, and what they found is that there was basically no substantial
Well, actually, I've got a sheet here that John prepared, but talk about the 29 data points that she looked at. And the Colorado Department of Health took 10,000 air samples from across the state. And I think the conclusion of that study, which is by the state of Colorado, is that there is no noticeable health effects beyond 500 feet. And 500 feet is very significant because the state of Colorado requires that there be a setback of at least 500 feet. And so it's misleading, in my view, to do a study based upon 29 data points using another state's standards, and the use of those standards might be quite arbitrary, and then do it within a setback place or distance that's not permissible in Colorado. You're just linking all of these things together, and then you conclude, therefore, within 500 feet, there's a significant increase, and there's so much wrong with that, I think.
Well, yeah, there's two caveats there, right? First of all, you have a very limited set of data points, and then you're creating almost like a false correlation, because yes, you're right. The standards are there are no residents within 500 feet anymore, or at least in terms of where you can permit new wells. So. And I believe that was one of the things you pointed out in your blog post.
Yeah, definitely. And even in her press release, when she released the most recent study, she says the uncertainties in our risk assessment are substantial and the results are best suited for scoping policy and future studies.
Well, I think one of the other things that's notable here is...
John, I got to stop you. My conclusions are best used for scoping studies. What does that have to do with the headline? That there's a significant increase in cancer within 500 feet.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you point that out because, the headlines don't change even though she comes out and says this.
Well, she totally, she doesn't support the headlines. She just said, well, I've raised some couple of interesting points, and because of my interesting points, I think we got to study this further. And that's not the headline.
Right, yeah.
And, There are people fighting this on a number of fronts. There was an op-ed written by Dan Haley, the CEO of Koga, in the Greeley Tribune where, and I'm quoting directly from this, he said, in the article, the reporter points out that on average, Americans have between a 30 and 40% chance of getting cancer over their lifetime. This adds less than 1/10 of a percentage point to that risk. That is in the 8th paragraph under the headline that says cancer risk higher near oil and gas operations. And so the problem here is partially that we have Lisa McKenzie kind of leading with things that are misleading, but we've got irresponsible reporters here doing some lazy journalism. Is that fair to assess it that way?
Yeah, I mean, the facts are always buried at the end of the story.
Right.
And so, the lead, it's always going to be the headline is the clickbait. That's what you're going to see on social media. And honestly, a lot of times when this gets spread around on social media, a lot of people don't even click on it. They just see the headline and assume, oh, well, that must be true,
Yeah, this is a byproduct of the world that we live in. It's hard for people to there's so much going on, and there's such a volume of information out there at all times that it is difficult to get to the bottom of these things. So that's why headlines become ever increasingly important.
Yeah, and so essentially that's what we were trying to do with this EID health report, is just to get the facts out there. We compiled all of the findings from CDPHE that kind of touches on this subject, and we just wanted to make that available to the public, to have that inserted into policy discussions surrounding this and the public discussions in public forums.
Do you get pushback when you push things like this out there, when you are debunking these studies? What is the public reaction like to that?
I mean, honestly, we do a debunk, we post it on Twitter, and that's where you kind of see some of the backlash, is just some of the trolls. It's the typical people.
The Twitter eggs?
Yeah, just the fringe. So.
Yeah. It's interesting.
Well, and which mainline newspapers, and that's kind of a loaded phrase because I don't know if there are mainline newspapers, but the ones in Colorado, the people that typically read, have those newspapers run your stories, or have they just left her study that it causes cancer unrebutted?
Actually, we did have a really good piece in the Denver Business Journal covering our EID health report, and that was really great to, actually get that information out there into the public rather than always being on the defense. So that was a good story.
How about Boulder Daily Camera, Denver Post?
I did have an op-ed in the Denver Post related to the EID health report.
So, you've got to almost take the narrative into your own hands, because when you submit a guest op-ed, that's much different than working with a reporter. And I think one of the other problems is we have a low media literacy right now, where people can't always tell the difference between an op-ed and a journalism piece. So to that end, you can almost use that to your advantage in that sense, where you go, look, these are the facts. This is on the opinion page, but these are the facts that I can point you to. These are studies. This is a quote from Dr. Larry Wolk at the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. And to that end, you need to almost take the narrative in your own hands, because there's also a shrinking pool of reporters from which you can draw.
Yeah, and even on the other side, the Boulder Daily Camera, all of the time, I mean, that's what they have going on at the activist groups. They have a campaign to submit as many LTEs as they can, and they shoot that around on social media as if it is facts when it's opinions.
Right.
So.
When it's user-submitted letters. And for anyone listening, LTEs, that's parlance in our world quite frequently, but that's letters to the editor.
Well, I wonder what the ratio is. If you have something that the author admits her study does not support the headline, yet she doesn't take back the headline. She's given a story from a very, very credible source, Colorado Department of Health. The data points are 29 to 10,000. How many of the stories do you have to get out there to sort of debunk the misleading stories, or is it impossible to debunk it because nobody reads the stories and nobody can tell the difference between the true story and the false story?
Yeah, and that's the challenge that Energy in Depth is faced with, right? That's one of our objectives, is to try to get that information out there.
Well, one of the things that I'm curious about is you've articulated that this is not the first time that Lisa McKenzie has put forth studies like this. Can you take us through sort of some of the history of that and where it started and where it is today?
Yeah, definitely. So like I mentioned, this is kind of like a playbook that's been laid out since 2012. And when it first hit, it definitely went to a lot of the bigger news outlets like Bloomberg headlines.
Oh, so national stuff.
Yeah, yeah. And if you notice, we actually recently we did a blog post on the whole playbook, and we put together this infographic that kind of lays out the headlines versus, you know, the activists spreading them, and then the facts, like state health regulators coming out and saying, you know, this is what this study's really about. And you can see the way it dwindles, and it's like national headlines 2012, and then it goes down to just like Boulder Daily Camera and like more of the locals. And it kind of has fizzled out a little bit, especially this last report.
So this is to diminishing returns in your estimation.
Yeah.
Who is funding studies like these?
You know, it's unclear, given that, you know, she is a professor at the University of Colorado, public health. So yeah, we haven't pinpointed that.
So it's interesting because it's one of those cases where it's helpful to follow the money, but that's not always one of the easier things to do.
Yeah, except for when it comes to these climate lawsuits. I mean, you can definitely follow the money there.
Well, let's switch over to climate lawsuits. First of all, we touched upon that in our last segment, but why don't you just briefly outline what the climate lawsuits are about and where the money's coming from?
Yeah, definitely. So April 17th, just a few weeks ago, you know, the city and county of Boulder, along with San Miguel County, which is Telluride, Colorado, announced their climate lawsuit. The interesting thing is, you know, most of the lawsuits we've seen in the climate change front, they've been all coastal communities, you know, California, New York City. So Boulder and San Miguel County is the first of its kind being in an inland, which is really interesting, as well as the oil and gas companies they chose to sue.
Should we be flattered? Since we're the first ones here in flyover country.
Yeah, I think so. So basically, they've targeted Boulder because, you know, Boulder's
had a moratorium and has had a vein of rich anti-oil and gas activism for a long time now. There was a moratorium that lasted 5 years. Usually moratoriums are done when you want to update your rules. You know, there's a new technology that comes in, there's a new business sector, there's any number of new things that come in, and you want to make sure your rules are right. And typically that takes maybe 6 months, maybe 3 months. Moratoriums usually don't last that long. Boulder had a rolling moratorium that became a de facto ban. And so in terms of targeting Boulder for climate change, I think the overall environment was ready and ripe for someone to come in and say, hey, you know, I know there's a rich history of anti-oil and gas activism here. Maybe you should think about targeting oil and gas companies for their role in climate change, or their perceived role in climate change. Is it fair to characterize it that way?
Yeah, and I think it's important to note who did come in and who's going to carry these lawsuits out for the city and county of Boulder and San Miguel County, and that would be a Washington, D.C. based nonprofit organization, Earth Rights International, and
it looks like it's NISKANEN, the Niskanen Center.
Yeah, the Niskanen Center.
Okay. David Bookbinder.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Actually, and it's important to note that there's direct connections with these wealthy anti-fossil fuel foundations, including the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, Open Society Foundation, which is George Soros' group. So it's clear that, you know, this is building on a national campaign brought by these trial lawyers and funded by these wealthy anti-fossil fuel foundations.
So what kind of role has Energy in Depth had in pushing back against lawsuits like this, or in particular the Boulder lawsuit?
Yeah, so we've done a lot of work looking into these groups and finding out, you know, where they come from, where the follow the money type thing, because, you know, when they approach Boulder, the city of Boulder and county of Boulder, they're telling them it's pro bono, and we're like, how is that possible? Like, this sounds very expensive. So it's good to know, like, what is behind all of this. You know, and it's important to also note that Colorado doesn't want this. I mean, it's pretty clear the reactions. They came out quickly. You had the Denver Post editorial board who responded to this, you know, saying how important fossil fuels are to, you know, our overall lives, our economy, lifting people out of poverty, and to compare that to the tobacco industry, which is kind of like what their legal their game is, it just doesn't make sense. It misses the mark, basically.
Right. And Peter, you mentioned in our last segment, you talked about the tobacco playbook from 20 years ago. Where, in your estimation, is there a disconnect between what the tobacco lawsuits were about 20 years ago versus what they are now, or what these climate change lawsuits are now?
These lawsuits are totally different, and I'm just doing this from memory, but the tobacco lawsuits, you had a number of insiders. You had almost 50 years of evidence showing direct causation between the use of cigarettes and the use of nicotine and certain types of lung cancer. You had evidence of tobacco companies trying to make the delivery of nicotine more efficient, which would cause more cancer for the purposes of pushing sales. And so those types of lawsuits, you had insiders, you had clear scientific evidence, you had causation, which means that you could prove that the action of the defendant caused the harm. You could show that the harm was a nationwide harm, and it was especially insidious because tobacco was being targeted for inner city youth and was being targeted on the poor. And smoking trends. Here, if you look at the issue of climate change, there's no causation whatsoever that I've seen in any of these lawsuits. I haven't read them extensively, but I've read about.
And certainly not A to B in the same way that you're describing with the tobacco lawsuits.
Actually, no causation, because the actions of these companies and climate change, and really talking about the anticipated damage to shorelines in California because of rising waters. And they're trying to say that is direct related to the activities of BP Corporation.
Right.
I'm not aware of any evidence of that. More importantly, I think our last guest mentioned that in 2011, that nuisance lawsuits based upon clean air information, that the U.S. Supreme Court found that was preempted under a legal principle called federal preemption. There's also state preemption. But federal preemption states that if an area of regulation, which is an area of national concern, is comprehensively regulated by the federal agency, and if it is or could be regulated by that agency, that there is no state right law action. And many lawsuits are dismissed on the basis of preemption. So I would think, I know it's very early in the lawsuit, it's filed on the 17th, but I would imagine that the lawyers for the companies are going to transfer to federal court, number one, and number two, seek dismissal, and hopefully seek sanctions.
Absolutely. It's interesting times that we live in, and I know Vital for Colorado is out there trying to educate and advocate, as is Energy in Depth. Rebecca, where can people find out more about Energy in Depth?
Yeah, so you can visit our website, energyindepth.org, and then also please follow us on Twitter. That's going to be at EID Mountain MTN States.
Fantastic. Rebecca Simons, Field Director for Energy in Depth Mountain States. Peter Moore, our host, CEO and Chairman of Vital for Colorado. Visit us on the web, vitalforcolorado.com. Thank you very much for joining us today, and have a wonderful day.
Thanks, Rebecca. I'll be looking for your articles.
Thanks for having me.